On July 8th, we have our tele-intervention and progress monitoring strategies for academics and behavior. And on July 27th, or 22nd, we have our topic is school reentry planning for school psychologists. And so we just want to call, ask for a call out for any resources that you may have. If you would like to present on either of these topics, please let us know. We will put our communications email into the chat box soon. And on that note, if you have any information on those topics, as well as other topics that you'd like to talk about, we can definitely try to see if we can fit those in. So just contact us at that OSPA communications email. Thanks.
Perfect, and we'll put up all that contact information at the end as well. So we're really excited for our presentations today, an opportunity to answer a lot of the questions that I know you guys have been asking us and yourselves, and kind of pondering over the semester. Just a couple kind of rules of engagement for these Zoom meetings. You probably have heard these before, but if you do have a camera, we ask that you turn it on so we can see your faces. And if you are not speaking, please mute your microphone so we don't get any of that feedback or background noise. And when you do speak, please state your name when you begin to talk so that we know who you are, and especially if your camera's not on, we can't see your face. And if you have any questions throughout, feel free to chat those to us in the chat box. You can either directly chat me or the whole group, and we will be monitoring those with our presenters and trying to stop and answer them as we go. And with that, I am super excited. We are going to have a presentation today on the best practices from what we can tell in this current situation. We have Dr. Ryan Farmer from OSU, and Jackie Johns from Collinsville, and Dr. Catherine Moore from OU, starting here next week. So we are excited to get their perspective and the research that they've done. So I'm going to hand it over to our presenters now.
Okay. All right, so I got that share screened, and so I think that Dr. Farmer is going to start us off. So whenever he's ready.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. So we are talking a little bit about best practice considerations with regard to remote assessment, right? And the really big question is remote assessment of standardized tests, right? Cognitive tests, achievement tests, those are the bugaboos. Those are the ones that keep us up at night. I will say that best practice is probably a misnomer at this point. It's more of a what the heck do we even know at this stage. And I kind of want to give you all just a little overview of what we do know. A few of us have spent, well, frankly, I'm a little scared to even tell you how much time reviewing all of the remote administration literature. Looking at, it looks like there are two peer-reviewed papers on this, and then there's one white paper that was released by PAR, the publishing company. So we should absolutely trust that one entirely. And then there's quite, you might be surprised to learn, there's actually quite a large literature on remote assessment in the neuropsych world. So for adults and older instruments, yeah, you can leave it here for a second, for older instruments. And so there's actually been quite a bit that's been done that's out there. And what's nice about that is that it kind of gives us a jumping off point. We aren't walking into this completely blind. We're legally blind, but we're not completely blind. And so as we kind of approach this stuff, here's what we know from the adult literature. We know that in general, tests that are given either remotely or given in person tend to give you approximately the same scores for groups. That for groups is going to be important. I'm going to keep coming back to that. And for the adult literature, we also know that whether you give someone a remote test or an in-person test, they're probably going to walk away with a largely similar score on most subtests. All right. There are some subtests that even when they're digitized or modified, they just don't translate to the digital environment. And you can probably all guess which ones I'm talking about. These are the ones with fine motor components, right? These are the ones that have really sensitive timing, right? Just because there's lag when we're talking about this stuff. And so we're talking about block design. It's pretty much gone. We really shouldn't be administering block design. We're talking about cancellation, symbol search, these kinds of things. They're just not going to work. And don't even bring out Rover. Like, we just need to leave him in the box. Okay, that's just not going to work. So these are the kinds of subtests that just aren't going to translate to that digital environment. And so we know this. We know this from the adult literature. They've been working on this for a while because there's a large population of folks who live in rural environments or in hospitals in more rural areas where they need to provide ongoing cognitive progress monitoring for folks who have early onset dementia, those types of age-related cognitive decline, right? And so they've been working on this stuff, and that's great. But then coronavirus came along, and they said, "Hey, we should go ahead and try and make this mainstream for kids." And there were two, like I said, there were two studies that were out, and then the one white paper. The two studies that were out, one looked at the WISC-5, and one looked at the RIAS-2, and we'll talk a little bit about those in just a minute. Yeah, we'll jump to the next slide now, if that's okay. Before I start jumping into what these articles look like and what the results tell us, I want to kind of lay the groundwork for what even we're looking for, right? There's a lot to be argued that, so let me just say, what you're going to hear, if you haven't heard it already, is equivalency is what matters. Equivalency is what matters, right? As long as you can give this test either in traditional format or remote format and get approximately the same score at the end, then everything else should hold, right? And there's some logic to that. There's some face validity to that argument. I'll explain why I have qualms with the way it's been approached so far, but there is some validity in that argument. It's basically alternative forms of the same test, right? If you could give the Wilcox-Johnson Achievement Form A and the Wilcox-Johnson Achievement Form B and get approximately the same score, then they're right. It really doesn't matter. We can assume that a lot of the information is going to generalize over. That's not the research they're doing, and we'll talk a little bit about why and how that looks different. Fortunately, we have major international organizations on the side of validity and defending students in this case. So we have the International Test Commission, and they've defined this kind of modification of a test as a new format, because it is, right? It is a new format of this test, or at least it's an alternative format of these tests. And so they're really going to want construct validation again. They're going to want validity of response processes, right? So when I say validity from response processes or validity of response processes, what I'm saying is, are students engaging in largely the same behaviors, be they visible behaviors or private behaviors, in order to complete these problems. Now, a lot of times we can assume that the private behaviors are pretty similar, right? Especially if we're doing something like vocabulary. Vocabulary, we ask them, hey, how are two things alike? And they say, right? So their thinking process is very similar. Even their behavior process, the visible portion of this spectrum, is still pretty similar. They're just saying their answer out loud. But how it might be a little bit different when we're using stimuli, right? So visual. So when you're presenting the words on the screen, when you're showing some information about, when you're showing spelling words or written out words on the, right? We don't always know exactly what that looks like. And there's we know how it should look, but we can't always be as certain as we are in person. And so as you can imagine, this is the ideal situation, giving verbally administered items and they're giving us a verbal response. That's the ideal situation. But as soon as we move to showing them pictures or they're pointing, those kinds of things, we're going to run into some difficulties. And some of it translates really well and less well. Inferential validity, this is where we're making inferences, right? We don't just say, well, you know, they got a 9 on this WISC 5, and that's wonderful. We would expect them to get a 90 on their next WISC 5 as well. We don't stop there in our inferences, we go beyond that. And so because trying to go beyond that, we have to know, well, how does this test link up with other things in the real world? Does it have effects in the real world beyond talking about on this one test? Because if, let's be honest, if all we were able to say is that they're most likely to get another 90 on a test, these tests aren't very useful, right? I could go on an entire 2-hour lecture on that. We're not going to. And then, of course, ITC is going to recommend reliability and types of validity as well. My point in going through all this is to just lay the groundwork expect from these tests. And I hope the thing is we largely expect the same thing from these tests that we would from any other we would give, right? We can go ahead and move to the next. So what do we know? I said that a huge focus from publishers and proponents of this have been focusing on equivalency. And again, it makes perfect sense that if you give 10 subtests to a kid and you get the same raw score on every subtest, that it doesn't matter, right? If 5 of those were traditional and 5 of those were remote and you see the same scores mapping onto each other, then sure, everything else should hold. Unfortunately, that's not what we're doing. We're not actually looking to see if I administer, let's say, vocabulary to the kid, and then I administer vocabulary digitally or remotely to the kid. Are those scores the same? That's not the question we've always been asking here. In this, what you'll notice is that I have 2 groups. I have test 1 raw scores and test 2 raw scores. And I know it seems like a silly thing, but the plural in scores is really important here. The plural in scores is really important because if I were talking about 1 kid, it would just be test 1 raw score. I'm not talking about 1 kid. We can move to the next slide. So those 3 relevant studies I mentioned have looked at the WISC 5, the WJ Cognitive Achievement, and the RIAS 2. 2 of these have been done by Jordan Wright, who has done quite a bit of work with APA. You may have seen his webinar on teleassessment and best practices. He provides largely a conservative approach to teleassessment, and I think that's wise and prudent at this point, given the information we have. Looking at his studies, they're a great first step. I'm not knocking what he's done so far. But I think we need to acknowledge how those studies were done and what those tests actually tell us. So first, a few small details, and then I'm going to focus on the last one quite a bit. First of all, they carefully controlled the environment. Think about that for just a second. They carefully control the environment. In fact, in most cases, what they did is whether they were traditional or remote, they brought them into the clinic or school. And so if they were traditional, they just gave the test the way we traditionally would. And if they were remote, then they were in the next room. So that's the first big flag that we need to think about as we move forward. So how well does that generalize to what we're doing right now, where we're potentially a city apart and they're sitting in their living room with their siblings running, right? That's a massively different context. They carefully controlled the technology and hardware. So not only did they have them in that more secured, more clinical environment, but they also knew exactly the they had in front of them. They knew exactly the mouse they had. They knew exactly the quality of the internet connection. It's ironic. You just told me that my internet connection is unstable. That's fun. almost like a little bit of clairvoyance of where I'm. In addition to that, in studies, they actually used trained facilitators as well. A psychologist who was administering the test was not in the room, had someone trained to administer the fine motor portions in the room with them to give those subtests. And so they would hand them the cancellation or symbol worksheet when it was ready. I'm using the WISC-5 as an example here, but really this generalizes to all of these. So they had someone hand over the materials when it was appropriate. They even managed behavior a bit in these studies, right? They were trying to really just narrowly focus on, do the subtest work across environments? That's all they were asking. And then this last one, I'm not going to try and go into like research methods and design here, but it's really important that we actually talk about and understand the implications of this last point. They used equivalent groups design. Let me explain what equivalent groups design is. We'll jump to the next slide. So it's crucial, it's important, it's massively important. So an equivalent groups design basically means they took a huge sample, okay, a decent sample of kids, and they randomized whether they got the remote test or the traditional test. That's it. Let's jump to the next slide. So they took this random sample of kids, they randomized whether they got the remote test or the traditional version, and then they simply looked to see were the scores on the remote version equivalent to the scores on the traditional version. And again, like I said, that's an excellent first step. But what we're really asking here is the mean score of group 1 statistically different from the mean score of group 2? Again, great first step, but that's not what we care about. School psychologists working in schools and private practices and whatnot. Sure, they had great results, again, with the exception of fine motor test, which at least has fully acknowledged. Right, that's great. The mean IQ of the remote group was approximately 100. The mean IQ of the traditional group was also approximately 100. This is great news, right? We'll jump to the next slide. But I think we're asking the wrong question. Do we really care if a group of kids administered test 1, it gets an approximate score to a group of kids administered test 2? No. What we really should be caring about, if I give this kid test 1 or test 2, will the score be different? They haven't done the studies yet at all. They simply haven't done those studies. Now here's the deal. We can say, oh, think about this. Remember that adult literature? They recommend doing exactly what I'm describing to you right now. They call it a within group equivalency design. They recommended that a few years back. This isn't novel. It was recommended before any of these 3 studies. And while these 3 studies are wonderful in what they do, and again, like I said, they're great and they provide that first step, it is not the clinically actionable data we actually needed for this situation. And so the confidence that seems to be exuded from the proponents of this completely ignores some of the gaps in the literature here, and maybe completely ignores is unfair, right? Maybe they're quite aware of it, but recognizing that, we have to do something right now, right? There's a danger of good intentions, as you might say, though. All right, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. So what are practical aspects of all this? Well, in traditional testing, there are 4 general types of what we call construct irrelevant influences or unique sources of error, right? Some weird stuff might be going on with the kid, right? Maybe they didn't sleep well. Maybe they forgot their medication. Maybe they took too much medication. Maybe they didn't have breakfast. Maybe they just broke up with their significant other. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they're anxious, right? All of these things are the validity of our test. We all know this. We were all taught this in grad school. This is nothing new. There's things that can come from us. Maybe we've had a bad day, right? Administering IQ test after spilling coffee on myself. And it just, it never felt quite the same. Maybe it was the third degree. I don't know. But regardless, I can pretty much guarantee that my attention was not exactly where at that point in time. We've all been there. That doesn't mean your test was invalid, but it's certainly a source of potential error in your administration, right? Now, there are other more pressing issues here. Since if you fail to push a basal, or if you skip a reversal, or any of those things. We've obviously all dealt with that at some point, maybe in our training, but are certainly probably pretty good at it now. But that said, your mood, your influences, etc., including your proficiency with each test you give. That's an important point as we think about remote administration stuff, because for some of us, it might be the first time we're using digital administration. For others, it might be the first time that we're using video conferencing to observe a student. For others, it might be that we're simply not familiar with the subtests we're using because they've substituted out some of those fine motor tests that we're used to. I mean, let's be honest, in almost every test I've given in my life, I've started with block design. Well, I can't do that right now, right? And so just these simple adjustments, our experience is less valuable right now, a little less valued. And it's not that it's not great in general, but this is a new area for a lot of us, and we're doing things we're familiar with. And anytime that's the case, we have to think carefully about how our psychometric skill might influence the administration of the test we're giving. The environment. All right, so in a good day, right, we're testing in a broom closet, there's someone playing dodgeball against the wall, and choir practice really needs to practice on the other side of the hall, right? So there's always environmental factors at play. But typically, we can control the room we're in, right? We can decide what's on the table. We can decide, to some extent, what's within reach of the child. We can decide whether there are other people in the room. We can decide if the door is closed. You may not have those choices if you're testing them at home, right? And even if, pretend for that you get perfect setup at home, there's no one else in the room, you're in like a family room with no toys, siblings, parents, etc. Everyone is out of the room, the door is closed. I bet you a lot of kids, that computer is still a source of entertainment. Right? This is a computer that they've sat at time and time again and thought, ooh, what game will I play now? Wonder what's happening on Instagram, right? And now you're asking them to point to the pattern that matches. They're going to get bored a lot faster just because they're used to sitting at this computer and getting entertained, right? So that's another factor that's going to here. And I consider that part of the environment technology, because technically, if there's a Game Boy sitting on, that also could be part, or a book that they enjoy reading, et cetera, et cetera. The test itself, okay, we've beaten the test into the ground. We've talked about those studies. I'm not going to keep going over that. All of that's important. All of that needs to be addressed, right? And then finally, technology. If you've seen, I know Wright's webinars are kind of hard to get into, but if you've seen Wright talk, one of the things he'll tell you is that high-speed internet access is recommended. And that's a great perspective, unless you're working with low SES students in Oklahoma, right? It's not reasonable. It's not practical. A lot of folks aren't even going to have internet access at all. And then, of course, you're going to want 2 cameras, right? You want the student to have 2 cameras, according to Dr. Rayford at WISC, with the WISC. And so right there also is another issue of, well, what is good enough? Can I get away with 1 camera? Is it okay if one of those cameras is really, really bad? But let's go back to the internet access part. what if the student is moving and lagging, right? How do you know that that the mouse cursor on your end actually picked up all the movements that the child made while trying to point to the right matrix response? You don't, right? Especially if the internet's bad. And so there are a lot of additional error that we really, really have to consider when we're engaged in remote admin. Now, one of the things you may have noticed in my little rant here is most about concerns and what are the additional variables. And I'm not offering a lot of we do's. I'll give you one big one. All right. This is actually, I'm just going to read this statement because from team working on this stuff, we caution school psychologists to be wary of good intentions during uncertain times. This has a desire to provide for the well-being of children. The provisional limitations enumerated in what we've talked about so far suggest caution, if at all, with remote testing to determine eligibility for special education related services in response to the unique challenges presented during this time. Encourage decision makers in school psychology to consider the potential downstream effects that are likely to occur with the premature adoption of unproven technology adaptations in a time of crisis. We can also talk about, and I'm just going to throw rotation up in the air and let you fret over that. In most states, I'm tempted to say all states, but I'll stick to most. In most states, teletherapy and telepsychology is completely managed by the psychology board, right? And so maybe that psychology board has granted additional rights to their to practice during this time period. And we've seen some statements to that effect. But what if licensed or certified by that? Most of us, most school psychologists at least, are certified through the Board of Education or within the educational system in some way. Do those same rights extend to us? We don't know the answer to that. And there's not been any sort of federal guidance. So there was a request to type that, and I will. But I'm going to finish talking real quick because type and talk at the same time. It'll be fun. I want to answer a couple questions about that came through. So the first platforms are there. So Right et al. And a few others have suggested that we need to use platforms that have been peer work. Because you need to make sure you have the functionality, camera options, etc., ability to observe the paperwork, and so on and so forth. Like others, like Cecil, and a lot more permissive in this sense. He suggested, I saw him suggest that Zoom is an appropriate venue for assessment. I don't know the answer here. I'm not saying I know one way or the other, but this was a question that came through. The short answer is just we don't know. We don't know what the influences of these different setups are. Certainly, there are variations in standardization, right? If a student is seeing it differently than another student who's being administered the same test, well, that's a pretty drastic difference in standardization, and we don't know the effects of that entirely. And I think we just need to understand that. I think we just need to understand that as we interpret these. I just realized that Dr. Rich made a good point. What I was referring to and talking about is actually from a paper that I wrote with Dr. McGill and gosh, a half dozen others on this topic. It's currently free from Contemporary School Psychology. I don't know how long it will stay free, but that is the preprint version that's up on the Open Science Framework. And so you can download that in perpetuity. Next question, can we work with local universities to establish standard error of measurement and other basic psychometric? Yeah, sure, that may help. That's a complicated discussion, and it effectively gets really deep into study design. There's actually not, you may be surprised, there's actually no good compendium of this is what a good assessment design looks like. There are things that are passed down and sort of held as quality by publishing companies, but I know of no single approach to doing this that is universally accepted. And so my point here is not to say this can't be done, but to say effectively you need someone who's an expert in this type of assessment, this type of research, because taking this in sort of an ad hoc or post hoc approach, anything that's anything less than formal is not going to give you the information you're looking for. It'll just increase your confidence. And so it's something that could be considered, but it would need to be very carefully structured. Yeah, I'll leave that there. And then this is actually even a harder question. It's a lot of the same answer. Can we work with local universities to establish a virtual normative sample? In other words, what if we create a normative sample just of virtual administrations? Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First and foremost is most of the time when we're giving a test, we're not giving it to any random kid off the street. Right, we're giving it to someone who's been referred for special education services or consideration for special education identification. And so we have a sort of a range restricted or limited sample there. And the same is true for the previous one, but it's less of an issue there. But now that we're talking about normative aspects, wow, that really amplifies the problem. Again, it's an extremely technical process. We'd have to get deep into research design, and again, you'd need someone who's an expert in that kind of procedure. Yeah, and it's a lot more complicated than I want to go into during this this conversation. So what can we do? I'm so glad you asked. Actually, no one asked, and so I added this question because I think this is really what we should be focusing on, right? So this is not out yet, but I will share a preprint with you all. McGill and I, and again, I said half a dozen others for the other one, an actual dozen others got together to talk about what are the measurement issues, what are the legal issues, ethical issues, cultural and linguistic issues, diversity issues, etc., with doing remote testing now and as we move forward. One of the things I will say, not meaning to terrify anyone, is I think coronavirus and our physical distancing protocols opened Pandora's box on remote administration. I don't think it's going away when things return to normal. I think, in fact, I know of at least one school district that has stated that they're going to have school psychologists work from District Central and administer remotely to the school used to travel to. And so there may, in other words, cutting down on travel time and potentially increasing the number of tests that can be administered in a day. As an example, I learned that presence learning will of assessment includes cognitive achievement, any other batteries that are necessary, curriculum-based measure if necessary, observation for $300. So from a financial standpoint, I think there's a risk there that we can see assessment drifting in that direction. It's something we should be aware of. Well, okay, so what can we do now, well, aside from my doom and gloom predictions? And I apologize for that moment of terror. That's going to be on the next Simpsons Treehouse of Terror, by the way. It's going to be fantastic. First of all, we're only going to give standardized tests when it's absolutely unavoidable and 100% necessary. All right, I'd like to think that this was always the case, but I'm no fool. And I'm well aware that, you know, there's a checkbox and we're having to meet that for, let's be honest, bureaucratic reasons. In this case, I think we need to very seriously reflect on the potential for harm in administering a test that we don't know is valid. Right, and so OCR has the Office of Regulations. I'm struggling with the acronym right now. I've always called them OCR for the last 10 years. OCR has issued that we have a bit more leeway than we might think, and it's documented in that link I just sent you. And so districts and state agencies should definitely be tapping into that whenever possible. I would pass that on to your district legal representatives and not try and tackle it yourself. Just my own CYA there. When you have to give a test remotely, right, we're asking a question that's actually relevant to a standardized test. You're going to need to screen for those unique sources of variance, right? So there are some things that are out there. For instance, Kranzler and Floyd have a screening tool for assessment that walks through some of these variables. You'll also need to do technology checks and make sure that you don't have too much lag, that you have the right software, that you have the right training to use the software, right? There's a lot of steps here. This isn't a plug and play situation where you pick up the technology and you run with it that same day, right? It's not so simple as logging into a Zoom meeting. It's knowing the ins and outs of that software, being able to control it expertly with fluency, right? Not just accuracy, but fluency. When you're interpreting scores from remotely administered tests, I encourage you, and this is consistent with Wright et al. And his group, be extremely conservative, right? Focus only on those test scores that are, I'll come to that in a second, actually. I'll get to the last. Think carefully about your test. Right, it's potentially but progress monitor, right? We need to be confirming that decisions we've made were efficacious for the kid. All right, we can jump to the next slide. I mentioned conservative. So what does conservative interpretation actually look like? Avoid questionable interpretation strategies. I'm going to go ahead and point at my soapbox. I'm not actually going to stand on it today, but I am going to point at my soapbox. Do not engage in profile analysis, right? Eschew subtest level interpretation. Don't look at comparisons between subtests. Don't look at comparisons between indices. Focus on the portions of the test that have the most reliability and the most validity, because in this situation, there's a good chance that it's even less than we think it is, right? And since I would say the greater scientific community of assessment folks who are engaged in empirical scientific practice, or I'm sorry, empirical and scientific research with these tests, have been saying since 2000 that profile analysis shouldn't be used, and for at least 5 years, PSW shouldn't be used. We definitely want to make sure that we're only using those scores that have the most reliable validity. Again, I'm not going to keep beating this particular box. Yeah, so in the past, a lot of times what I've heard is, well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I know that's what the research is suggesting. However, in my experience, I've seen this as being really useful and easy. Well, your experience no longer matters. And I don't want to be insulting. What I mean is, this is a new environment. This is a completely new instrument. These are completely new conditions with completely new unique sources of error. You have no experience here, right? You have only what is in front of you. And what is in front of you is what we know so far from the empirical literature. And I don't mean to degrade clinical at all. It will be developed, but we rely on clinical judgment that might be developed after 6 months of doing this. We have to rely on what we know right now. Here's one that I think I stole this from Jordan Wright. Use 99% confidence. Typically using 95. In this situation, we want to make sure that we are being cautious. And so using that 99% confidence interval will help. It will decrease our precision, but it increases that our true score, what we're really captured by the range of the score. Okay. And then again, this goes back to progress monitoring. Great. Confirm what down. Test limits with your right. I know that's sometimes a luxury, but in situation limits might give us that little bit of extra information to confirm Not that the score should be changed, but it might help us to know, okay, this does seem like an actual ceiling. Okay, seem like an actual basal to me, right? Basically, for evidence that you're wrong. For that evidence that you're wrong. If you can't find it, then that's good information that, given what you know, you can move forward. We can jump to the next slide. And I always come back to this quote from Weiner. I have an M there, but it's an N. It's fine, whatever. Assessment is knowing what you're acting accordingly, necessarily getting the author's name right. So I always lean on that, right? We always talk about what is ethical, what is best practice, what is evidence-based practice. When it comes to assessment, it's knowing what our test can do and acting in accordance with that knowledge. We don't know what a lot of our procedures right now can do. So we should act skeptically and conservatively moving forward. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll also see the floor.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Farmer. I really appreciate that. I think that was really good information that everybody probably is very happy to have gotten from you. So thank you. I wanted to start my part with this quote here by Brene Brown. It's a quote that I found in one of her podcasts. She's one of my favorites. And I found this in March, and I've really enjoyed it, and I thought about it a lot during this time, where she says, it's all about first times and how hard it is to be new at things. Oh, sorry, my husband is talking here in the background. I apologize if you guys heard that. One of the things with working remotely here. So from small things to global pandemics, when we have no relevant experience or expertise, the vulnerability, uncertainty, and fear of these firsts can be overwhelming. Yet showing up and pushing ourselves past the awkward learner stage is how we get braver. So I love that because, again, this is a new experience for all of us. We've been trying to figure it out for the past several months of what we can do, what we should do. So then let's talk about, how do we do this? How do we get past that uncertainty, and how can we best do assessments during this time? Of course, due to the school closures and the shift toward virtual learning, providers across the state have really indicated that they need some guidance. So it's definitely a topic we've been talking about throughout the last couple months. And one of the big concerns that we've seen brought up is how to do assessments for initial and reevaluations at this time. So we talked about OCR earlier, and so OCR did give us some good guidance here that many of you may have already seen. But they said that if an evaluation of a student with a disability requires a face-to-face assessment or observation, the evaluation would need to be delayed until school reopens. Evaluations and reevaluations that do not require face-to-face assessments or observations may take place while schools are closed, so long as the student's parent or legal guardian consents. So I think that's some good, important guidance for us. Dr. Farmer had mentioned a little bit that, we do have a little bit of leeway with that. And so the same guidance is upheld by the Oklahoma State Department of Education and the National Association of School Psychologists as well. Some additional guidance from NASP. It talks about how some assessment publishing companies do allow us to use a test, any test that we deem appropriate, even if the publishers have not intended for the test to be virtually administered. However, we need to keep in mind that this raises issues, as we just talked about or just learned about from Dr. Farmer, regarding the reliability and the validity of the results that are obtained. Norming samples haven't included the telehealth administration, and so additional factors will need to be considered to maintain test integrity, including, of course, thinking who might also be in the testing room and the level of distractions that are present during the assessment. So what we came up with at OSPA is coming up with some guidance that we want to present here for all of you. Basically, these are some guiding questions for school teams. As we all know, it's important to balance that ethical considerations that we have with our child find obligations. So how can we best do this? And so we came up with these guiding questions. And of course, I have the caveat down there that these following questions are not intended to contradict or supersede any rules that are set by your district, but really offered as a resource to determine how best to move forward. And I want to encourage practitioners, of course, to first prioritize health and safety in their decisions, and then also consider all relevant legal and ethical issues. So we're going to start then with these guiding questions, and we're going to start with guiding questions about evaluations. These guiding questions, as I said, were developed to assist practitioners in making a determination of how best to proceed with each unique evaluation. And this is whether this is an in-person or a virtual assessment. We feel that these are some pretty important guiding questions for any kind of assessment that we would be doing. So the first one is, oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. Let me move back. The first one is, what is best for the student? Followed by, does the team have means to access adequate data to complete a sufficiently comprehensive evaluation in order to determine eligibility? Is the parent or adult student comfortable proceeding with an evaluation during this time? Can the evaluation tools and tests be administered as standardized? Will modifying test materials and procedures jeopardize the test security? And have considerations of equity been discussed? And so I just want to focus on that last one here a little bit longer. And again, to really keep that in mind when you're working with children, working with families. For example, does the family have equitable access to the stable internet connection? We've all seen those where it freezes and things like that. So again, that can be tough, especially in rural Oklahoma. They may not have access to that. And going even further than that, not just having that connection, have they had virtual general education instruction? Do they have the technological literacy skills that are necessary to even participate in the evaluation? All right, so those were some thoughts for evaluations. Moving on to some guiding questions for eligibility decision making. The first one is the evaluation sufficiently comprehensive? Is the student's performance due to a lack of appropriate instruction? Is the performance due to environmental or socioeconomic factors? Do the results reflect the student's functioning and needs in the school setting? Or are the results impacted by all of these stressors that are going on right now with this pandemic? And then again, it's always important to note, is appropriate caution being used when interpreting results? All right, so I think that it's important to work with your team with all of these questions. Again, I'm not trying to supersede any district rules or anything, but really work together, discuss these things with your team. And then some additional concerns and considerations for this. A comprehensive and individualized evaluation does require direct classroom-based observation of the student in his or her natural learning environment. So of course, given school closures and social distancing, it's difficult to gather evidence via remote observation about the student's difficulty in whatever that area is. The next point, standardized assessments are not designed to be administered virtually. We've talked about that a lot, and such tests really should only be given through the measures or the means in which they were developed. So any standardization deviations that you have need to be reported, of course, and it's important to realize that that can also invalidate any test results, and it could then impact our eligibility decision making. The last point on this slide is that if evaluations are to be conducted remotely, they should be conducted through platforms that are specifically designed for that purpose. And so again, we touched on this a little bit earlier, that really prior to administering any assessment, additional in-person training should be given to the evaluator, the student, the adult facilitator, but of course, that type of training is not currently available. Some additional concerns and considerations, think about the providers across our state. Of course, we serve a very diverse community of learners. Many of those are English language learners. And so when we're considering the equitable, valid, reliable evaluations, virtual assessment is, or virtual administration is probably going to lead to some additional barriers and could end up with some invalid outcomes then. The next point, current circumstances may lead to validity issues, which must be addressed when the assessments are taking place during this time, of course, of real heightened anxiety and uncertainty for everyone, for the students, for their family, for us. And furthermore, the presence of additional individuals in the room could lead to invalid results because their presence, of course, could alter the results that would be obtained otherwise in the typical setting that we would work with. And so invalid test results, of course, could lead to misidentification of students with disabilities. And so I think it's really important for us as teams to consider that, to really consider the impact that this pandemic has had. And then, of course, it's essential that legal and ethical guidelines related to privacy are followed. And so all platforms, of course, must be compatible with FERPA regulations. So hopefully those kind of questions will help you all to think about, have that as a framework to work with when you are working with your teams. Kind of the basic points I just want to leave with here for my part is that, of course, first of all, the mental health of students and staff is of utmost importance, and all children should receive the academic, social, and emotional supports that they need to be successful in the classroom. So I think it's so important to keep in mind that before any tests are administered, we really need to make a sustained effort to establish that sense of calm, that sense of trust, so that learning and then, of course, the assessment of learning can occur. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Catherine, who's now going to take the floor.
All right, thanks. So I am going to try to keep my section brief so that we have plenty of time to answer, or for you guys to ask questions and for us to do the best we can to try to answer them. But I'm speaking from the perspective of an outside evaluator. We did receive several questions in advance of the presentation just about what do we do if we receive an outside evaluation, how do we consider the data that would be included in that evaluation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. Essentially, so I did want to let you all know that Jackie and I presented our portions earlier this summer to COSA. And so any special education directors and administrators who chose to attend our session on tele-assessment and virtual assessment during COVID heard the information that Jackie shared and expressed interest in the guiding questions. So that was the one thing that we had questions about, wanting to get a copy of those questions. So hopefully, you know, we're trying to do our part to help facilitate getting the others on our teams, on the school-based teams, kind of onto the same page. But so this portion, I really succinctly tried to summarize for that audience that for outside providers, APA has been giving guidance very similar to, well, Ryan, Dr. Farmer kind of summarized some of that earlier and expanded on it more so. But there's just reasons why lots of outside evaluators have chosen, at least for a time, to kind of pause on the psychological assessment services. And that was especially during the time where we were under stay-at-home guidelines. And so a lot of places, including where I practice, we went to no in-office appointments. I'm going to say that I don't know any outside evaluators who have done any virtual standardized assessments. I know of, myself included, and others who tried to do portions of the assessment or the evaluation, such as the interview, maybe some limited observations and rating scales, things similar to maybe what you all have been trying to gather under our current circumstances within the school setting, and then postponed any kind of standardized assessment to when in-person would be more feasible. You can go to the next slide, Jackie. And so with that acknowledged, and with all the information that Dr. Farmer shared, I just want to say that as a private psychologist and kind of in that environment where I'm not necessarily as connected to others in the field, you know, you have to take the initiative to kind of seek that out and use resources like OSPA and OPA and NASP and APA to be able to get kind of the insight on what are we supposed to be doing right now? And so, as you all know, because you've received outside evaluations before, different outside psychologists take that to heart to different levels. And so of course I can't guarantee that all outside providers are seeking out that information and trying to use best practices, or maybe they're not even aware of kind of what information is out there and have gotten bits and pieces. All of that to say, of course, we're under all the same kind of legal and ethical obligations as private practitioners, as you all would be as school-based practitioners. And so, of course, acknowledging the limits. However, just different people's interpretations of those guidelines may result in you receiving different products if you were to receive an outside evaluation. So you can go to the next slide, Jackie. My advice would be just to keep this information in mind and feel free to reach out to the outside evaluator if you do receive a report that was completed during our current pandemic situation. At this point in time, I know many private psychologists are resuming in-person face-to-face assessments since we're not under the stay-at-home guidelines anymore. I don't know if that's going to change tomorrow, next week, next month because of our current rising numbers. But with public places opening, I know a lot of private clinics, given that it's not the same situation as a school building where there's going to be lots of students present at one time. There are limits placed on kind of, the child with one parent or guardian attending. So there's kind of certain precautions in place. And with that, it's important to kind of keep in mind as well, we've talked all about how kind of deviations from standardization in a virtual format would impact results. But it's also important to consider with resuming in person, face-to-face, there's kind of variations in terms of what different providers may be doing to try to protect health and safety. So if there's the use of a mask for the evaluator or for the child and the parent, if there's use of plexiglass shields or the face shield, all the different kinds of things that our society is becoming creative with and trying to kind of develop workarounds, which is useful for sure, but with standardized tests in particular, we have to keep in mind that those deviations as well can impact the validity. And so I've heard, kind of like Dr. Farmer was saying, it depends on who you're listening to, kind of how lenient you should be and what you can do or can't do. But when reviewing a report that you would receive from an outside provider, I would be looking for documentation of what deviations were made during the administration of the different components of the evaluation. How were those taken into account? How did the child respond? Did it vary from one subtest to the next? Was the full, assessment given? Was it truncated? I know I've heard some private practitioners are saying that usually they would give more subtests, but now they're just giving the core to get the full scale IQ, which is good. Instead of doing interpreting the different indexes. But anyways, tangent. So all of that to say, I would just say, if you have questions, if that information isn't there, if you're not sure, that you would call that provider and ask. And of course, coming from a collaborative stance that we're in uncertain times and that you just want to make sure that the information that they've provided, that you're interpreting that in a way that will be productive and useful and helpful for that child in the school environment. Really briefly, I'm going to just mention for those of you who the population you serve, you find yourself using the ADOS frequently, we are under significant limitations because of the nature of that assessment being very focused on social interaction and virtually, we all know that this is a different experience than face-to-face. As well, Dr. Kathy Lord, the developer of the ADOS, has provided some trainings, and she has stated that you cannot administer and score as you typically would the ADOS if any kind of deviations are made from the standardized instructions. So that would include wearing masks or other PPE, personal protective equipment. You can still administer it if you choose to and kind of use it as an observational tool. But again, keeping in mind kind of the limitations and how that child's responses may have been impacted by those deviations from the typical administration. And you wouldn't use like the total score or do the algorithms or anything. You would just use your observations in relation to the DSM-5 criteria. And then I included a link here because in light of that information, she and others at UCLA are working to develop a tool that could be used, especially in states where they're going to be very limited on in-person interaction for a longer time potentially, and that could apply to our state again too, I don't know, in our schools. But a brief observation of symptoms of autism, she's calling it the BOSA. So if you are looking for an alternative, this is something that's being specifically designed to be administered by a parent or a caregiver, whether it's in another room or whether it's at home, and there's logistics. I don't know all the answers to the questions about that, but I'm attending a training today. And so I included the link there at the bottom of that slide. And maybe if one of my other team members could copy and paste it into the chat box in case you're interested. I just wanted to share that. And then you can move on to my next slide. I'm not going to go in depth here on these slides because I'm preaching to the choir here. You already know kind of the steps that you would take if you receive an outside evaluation. I just wanted to tell you all that we did share this with administrators who chose to attend our session, so that they would seek you out as the qualified examiners to get your input on whether and what information to kind of use from that outside report. And then, yeah, you can go to the next slide. I'm just skipping through these. And now, as you know, always, you would kind of take into consideration what parts of the outside evaluation are useful and what additional data that you need, or if you have questions about kind of how the outside data really represents the school-based data, that as a team you would work together to address those questions and seek any additional data. And that takes us back to Jackie's portion of the guiding questions and how you can do that in our current circumstances. All right, that's my part. So I think we're finished with our portion. So if there's questions, we'll give some time for anyone to share those. And I don't know if we've had private, anonymous questions sent to the host.
I think one of the biggest questions was just about sharing resources and making sure that all this information is available. So we will post the links to the videos and the resources that we discussed. We'll have Dr. Farmer's article that he posted a link to available for you all as well. And there's also a nice infographic that you probably have seen coming around that Dr. Farmer and his team developed as well. So we'll make sure that's out there.
Catherine, this is Erica, and I see, well, now I think two, but the first question I think is directed to you, asking, would we expect to see within a report that teleassessment was used to document the variation in the standardized administration? And so I think it's just looking for, if this person is evaluating an outside report, they would assume that if it's not mentioned, it was face-to-face.
I think best practice would be to document that in the evaluation. And so if there have been deviations, I don't know for sure if everyone is kind of getting that same information about best practices. And so if it were me and I were wanting to be conservative, I would follow up and find out, just because there's been so much variation and creativity, if you will, during these current circumstances. So I would err on the side of conservatism and follow up and ask.
And then the second question, and I think this can maybe go to the group at large, is has there been discussion over due process concerns of conducting virtual assessments? Someone have information about that?
I mean, this is Jackie here. As far as if there's concerns, I think definitely yes, it's something that many directors I know are talking about and psychs are talking about. And I think, again, you know, the biggest thing that we've heard over and over again is to communicate with families, communicate with your team, document everything. So of course, those are all good practices to do. As far as any due process over doing it virtually, I think that's one of the reasons I probably would not want to do it virtually, because I don't feel that myself personally, I don't feel that I can say in good faith that I am doing an assessment that I think will be beneficial, valid, ethical, all of those things. I think I would try to, again, that's kind of why we came up with some of those guiding questions, to be creative, to come up with what all can we do. Of course, you can still do, you know, questionnaires. There's still some things you can do that don't require that face-to-face at this time. And who knows, when school starts in the fall, I know we're going to be talking about that here in about a month of what that's going to look like. And we'll be a month closer, so hopefully we'll have better ideas and answers than we do right now. I don't know, that's just my couple thoughts I have on it.
And this is Erica, and I would just add that I know the U.S. Department of Education is starting to have these conversations. They just put out an FAQ yesterday about IDEA parts B and C. And so I'm thinking, you know, they're slowly kind of trudging through some of these concerns as well to then pass on to state departments. And as Jackie said, hopefully we'll also have some additional guidance from our Oklahoma State Department of Ed, the SPED department as well. And I think just anytime you're doing an assessment, you know, we're kind of in a vulnerable place where we know we're always open to parents questioning due process or questioning pieces of our evaluation. And that was true even pre-COVID. So I think the more that you just use ethical decision-making models, that you refer to best practice, and that you're communicating and consulting with teams, I think that's the best information that we can say is document what you're doing, document that you consulted with the team, document your efforts in terms of best practice. And that's the best thing to do just every day in your practice. And that's going to help in those due process concerns with having a reasonable explanation for why not just you as a qualified examiner, but why the team made the decisions that they did. So was there anything else to that, Natalie, or did that help?
No, that does help. I figured it was kind of along that same line of just document everything to cover ourselves. I just didn't know if there had been actual formal conversations at either the legislative or at COSA or anything like that, as far as how we would be handling that sort of thing.
I think part of it is waiting on the USDE, and then, you know, I think we're all just in it together. The other thing I would just also touch on is something Dr. Farmer mentioned about this should be a process. It shouldn't be a one-stop point in time of assessment. And so regardless of what your decision is, you need to have, you know, progress monitoring, other kinds of redundant measures, and just keep checking in to make sure that whatever decision we're making, it lasts the test of time, and that we are making decisions in response to a student's and a school's current efforts. And again, that's best practice during all times. And so I think we just need to break this mold of our role as in this one snapshot in time to make an eligibility determination, and really widening it out to, are we providing on an ongoing basis the best services we can for kiddos? I'm going to invite you guys, we have about 15 minutes left. So if you have questions for our panelists, please type them in the chat or type them to Sarah. I do want to just reiterate two things while that's happening. One is, as Catherine mentioned several times, just know that OSPA is in communication as much as we can be with the directors groups, and we have a tight relationship with odds. And so we're trying to share this information with directors on behalf of OSPA so that we're communicating that as a state organization. We also have relationships with the OSDE Special Education Department. And so a lot of the things that we're talking to you guys about, we're also trying to share with other stakeholders and allied groups so that they're getting that same information. To that end, just today, we're going to be releasing a white paper. So that's a formal endorsement from OSPA. It's specific to Oklahoma, and it's called the Special Education Evaluations and Virtual Assessment During the COVID-19 Global Pandemic. And so you can consider that sort of a official response from your state organization regarding some of these issues. So in your conversations with your teams, your administrators, your colleagues, and even families, this is another resource that you can use to sort of help in that conversation and help to maybe advocate for your position on some of these items. So look for that. That was just passed through the board and will be coming through today. I'm not seeing questions. Sarah, did you have any of the hosts?
No.
So let's, at least for about 5 minutes, we can also just open the floor to any questions and concerns that you guys would have for our, not just our panel speaking today, but for our committee or for each other as colleagues. Part of these meetings are really just to give you guys space to have time to connect, time to collaborate, and time to talk to each other. So if there's a question that you have right now that's not even related to today's topic, now would be a great time to raise those questions or concerns or comments. Okay, I'm pretty good with silence. I can wait a long time. Oh, here is, thank you. This is from Michelle. Is there any communication with LPC organizations? Because we have LPC employed as school sites that are communicating information that does not align with OSPA. Thank you, Michelle. That's valuable information for us to have. And I don't know that we have made a direct connection, but we can certainly add that on our list of items and make sure that minimally we have a conversation and that they receive the white paper that we're producing, because you're right, that's important as advocacy for our best practice and to kind of protect our roles in the schools. Not that we don't want to have a good relationship with our LPC counterparts, but we certainly don't want to be giving districts conflicting information. Thank you for that. To the group at large, are there other stakeholder groups that we can communicate with or be in contact with on your behalf that would be helpful in your efforts in your district? And of course, I didn't mention also, I think clearly we have good relationships with our training programs in the state. I didn't mention that in my list, but of course we're in contact with our training programs as well. Okay, then Sarah, if you'll bring up the next little piece of the PowerPoint, I'll pass it on to Tricia for some wrap-up announcements, and we'll let you guys get on with your Wednesday.
Yes, I will do that. And I'm also getting ready to just post in the chat the 3 different links that have been posted throughout this. I know sometimes I get lost in the chat box. So that is the survey. So please fill that out related to the domain 8 and how OSPA can support you as you are working through how you're going to respond to the recent racial inequities that have come to light, but have always been there. And then also the paper that Dr. Farmer has recently had published, which references a lot of the great information he provided today. And then that link to the ADOS training of the brief assessment. So that is all there. And I will share the screen and turn it over to Tricia.
Okay. Okay, so last minute little things, and just so everyone knows, we are going to take another picture for our Facebook page. So after I go through this information, give us a few minutes, and people who want to jump off can, and then we'll have everyone turn on their video or their cameras and we'll take a picture. But for just contact information, so if you have any questions that come up, maybe they didn't come up during this meeting, but they came up after, a couple days later, feel free to reach out to our OSPA communications email, and that could be for the presenters or for our committee. You can also reach Erica and I at the Oklahoma State Department of Education, our crisis team, if there's any school crisis that you or your colleagues are experiencing right now. And then there's also, we always love to have more followers and get more likes and get more posts from our members. And so follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We have 2 more meetings. Again, those dates are July 8th and July 8th and July 22nd. And again, those you can read those 2 topics. We really would love to hear from more people and have a variety of speakers. So if you're interested in any of those topics or talking about them or just providing resources that go along with those topics, please reach out to us. I'd like to kind of shine a spotlight on our new Spotlight School Psychologist. You can go to our Facebook page and see who that was. That was Lee Harris, and there's a little quote about him, but congratulations to Lee Harris. And then also, we are still collecting nominations for the Spotlight School Psychologist, so please, we'll share another link for that, but please nominate yourself or a colleague. And just so you know, the nominations are anonymous, so we don't know who is nominating these people. And so if you want to nominate yourself and you don't want to feel bad about it, we will not know. So please submit something there. And then I think that's it on my end. Anyone else in the committee have anything else, or otherwise we will take a picture real quick.
I will. I just got a private question about maybe possibly with documenting the use of the PPE on the consent form and noting that like under other, that's going to be used. I think either there or definitely in your summaries, like if you have any PPE or done some distance things, then definitely document it either there or your MEEK summary would be very appropriate.
I think that's a really good point, and I didn't mention in the private practice setting, like we developed another informed consent for like resuming in person. So I don't know if you get to that point in the schools, that there are resources available from APA that we use to be able to kind of develop that.
And maybe we can, at our next meeting, if people want to come with some of those disclaimer statements, either related to non-standardized assessment or the use of PPE, I think it would be great. You don't have to bring them formally, just bring them, and maybe we can reserve some space to share those in the chat box, or to try to put together a document from the group at large so that we are not recreating the wheel and sharing those resources. So just keep that in mind. We'd love to have those of you that are already started to write some of those things. And yes, I'm also looking at you, Catherine, for some of those APA resources, but it would be great to get those all in one place.
All right, I think we're all good. We'll take, if anyone, if you guys feel comfortable turning your camera on, and we'll take a little screenshot to show School Psychs Unite here through the summer, trying to learn what all we can do for next year. And Trisha, are you taking that picture?
Yes, I will. And I'll give everyone a countdown so everyone can smile, and I'll take maybe a few just in case we have some closed eyes. Okay. Give a couple more minutes for people to decide if they want to stay on or not. Okay, just a few, 10 10 more seconds or so if you would like to stay on, or if you'd like to turn on your video camera. Okay.
All right. I think we're good.
I think we're good. Okay, countdown. 1, 2, 3. And then let's do another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you all for participating, and we will post our next outfit attire for our next meeting on our social media page. We forgot to do that at the beginning, but since you're on, we're going with our superhero theme. So get your best cape, and we will see you on July 8th.
All right. Thank you all, and thank you to our presenters. We really appreciate it.